About a year ago, I was teaching type 2 education to a group of newly diagnosed patients when one of the patients swore blind that adding a cinnamon supplement to his dietary routine improved his blood glucose levels. I've also had patients over the years convinced that adding a supplement marketed at improving type 2 diabetes control has improved both their fasting levels and their glucose levels throughout the day. Now, it's very difficult to take this at face value because often what the patient says and what actually the blood glucose levels read is slightly different in terms of their HbA1c or what they put down on paper or on their glucose meter. You also can't control all the different variables like weight loss or any dietary changes they've made, but it does prompt an interesting debate. Can adding supplementation or individual nutrients to the diet improve diabetes control? So after a very long period about wanting to blog on this, I finally got round to doing some research. And I can tell you that the most reported supplements or nutrients in the literature seem to be chromium, cinnamon and magnesium. So today I want to take some time just to delve into the evidence and tell you a little bit more about whether or not this is something you should be considering to improve your type 2 diabetes control. One thing that does seem quite common in the literature is people with low magnesium levels are more likely to get type 2 diabetes. There's also some evidence to show that people eating diets rich in chromium and magnesium have improved glucose control. However, before we get carried away, we need to look at the types of food that magnesium and chromium actually exist in. When you break it down, these foods are in foods like vegetables, fruits, whole grains, slow-releasing carbohydrates, lean meats and legumes. So essentially the types of foods that we're recommending for type 2 diabetes. So actually it may not be the individual nutrients themselves, but rather the macronutrients and the food compositions and the types of foods that they're eating that improve the glucose control. And it's this reason why studying nutrition is so difficult, because it's very hard to control just one type of nutrient. The best kind of research out there is what we call a randomized control study. Here we'll take two different groups where we give one group something to do, so we'll give them an intervention. We call this the intervention group. And we compare it against a group that we don't interfere with, and we could call this the control group. We can then test the effect of the intervention we put in place against the control group to see if there's any differences. This is how pharmaceutical companies test their medications between patients, because they can actually see cause and effect. So it's very difficult to do this with diet because foods don't exist in individual nutrients. They exist in many different forms and have lots of different nutrients in the same foods. So it's hard to isolate. So the only real way to do this is to do it in the form of supplementation. So you'll probably find it as no surprise that this is exactly what most studies looking at individual nutrients do. And this is where we can add cinnamon to the equation. Now, because nutrition isn't as big business as pharmaceuticals, you find that actually it's not as well studied, and this is why a lot of designs, study designs, tend to be with less people. They have varying methodologies, so it's very hard to compare between different methods because they use different criteria. They use different amounts of the supplement, so it's hard to compare again, and there can be a high risk of bias for these studies. As a result, you can get quite flawed study designs which we can't really draw much information from. This is why it's important not to jump into just one article and cherry pick the evidence, because you can almost prove anything if you just look at one article. You need to look at the best available evidence and then draw conclusions from the themes that come out of that robust evidence to draw your overall conclusion. This is why a lot of the evidence I use for these blogs is what we call review articles, because they kind of do the work for me. They draw upon all those individual studies and basically sum them up to see what the overall effect might be. The only problem is these aren't immune from study design flaws, and so you'll find that certain review articles have very good methodologies in terms of the articles that they include and their exclusion criteria, and you'll find ones that aren't so good and actually let a lot more articles in that may then skew the results. So let's see what I found. When looking at a lot of the articles individually, I did find some evidence actually to show that cinnamon, magnesium and chromium can have some benefit on blood glucose levels, lowering lipids and in some instances leading to weight loss. In fact, I probably found more articles reporting this than I did not reporting this. So it sounds promising, right? However, I did mention about these review articles and how these two are not immune from bias and study design flaws. Review articles and journal articles in general will also have what we call an impact factor. So the journal itself will have a hierarchy of how well that journal is perceived in the literature. So not all research articles out there will be able to get in certain journals. So a lot of these articles I was finding were being published in journals that I've not really even heard of or might have a very low impact factor. Whereas when we start looking at the more robust and maybe credible journal articles that have a higher impact factor, the results don't seem as promising, and the evidence for a significant difference in terms of blood glucose levels is much less, and in fact not significant at all. So a Cochrane review didn't find any added benefit of supplementing with cinnamon or chromium for their type 2 diabetes patients. However, there was some evidence to suggest that chromium helps with weight loss, but again not to the level where they suggest adding this into the diet. Diabetes UK also published their evidence-based guidelines in 2018, so last year, and looked at specifically the addition of supplementation to improve type 2 diabetes control. They too reported on some benefits of adding micronutrients to the diet to improve blood glucose levels, particularly chromium and magnesium, but again, not enough evidence was there to suggest adding this to patients' dietary regime. So the evidence isn't yet that convincing that we are advising this in practice. But with research, that's the beauty about nutritional science. We're led by the evidence. So if a benefit was to be found later down the line, then by all means we'd be adding this into our dietary recommendations. But this does lead me quite nicely to my summary. Supplementation with individual nutrients has not yet been proven to improve blood glucose control in type 2 diabetes. The studies that do show benefit are generally not very well designed or are published in very low impact journals that may not have the best reputation compared to others. They also lack the evidence to show if there's actually a long-term benefit in terms of morbidity and mortality. So in other words, what's the long-term outcome data? Keep in mind, supplementation doesn't address the underlying cause of type 2 diabetes. Even if it did work, it's kind of like papering over cracks. Therefore, the optimal way of managing type 2 diabetes for most people is to make a lifestyle overhaul. Try to eat the right foods, follow a healthy balanced diet and get as active as possible. This is the foundation of managing type 2 diabetes, and if you could be consistent with these changes, the glucose levels should come down and ultimately your condition should be better managed. Hopefully you found this useful. If you'd like more articles like this or want more information about diabetes, then check out my blog www.diabetesdietguide.com, or you can check out my services page, which is www.markgreennutrition.co.uk. I'll be back soon with more blogs, so until then, I'll see you later.